Afternoon, participants. I'm Marquita Wiley, and I'm welcoming you to our regular Friday afternoon Innovative Business Advisors webinar. We have a lot to cover today, and format-wise, we're going to do this similar to the way we've done it in the past. We're going to begin with an overview of the update on all that's happened since we met last Friday relative to the federal and state guidelines. Then we're going to move into a special topic, which I'll introduce in a minute. But first, I want to talk about logistics. Again, reminding you all, we're on the Zoom portal. Within that Zoom portal, you will see in the middle of your screen, for some of you, it's probably on the bottom. Some of you, it may be on the top. And it's a tab labeled Q&A. If you want to chat with us, and I use the word chat, do not use the chat button, use the Q&A button. Q&A button allows us to capture your questions. We can answer some of them while we're live here on the webinar, but it gives us a transcript that we will be able to send out to everyone after the webinar. Anything that's put into that other discussion box chat is lost after the webinar. So please use the Q&A tab to ask your questions. Okay, after this webinar, as I said earlier, you will receive a copy of the recording of the webinar, a transcript of all questions answered via the Q&A web, and you will receive copies of the PowerPoint slides that are being used through the webinar. So with that said, let me quickly introduce a topic. As in the past weeks, we have with us Steve Denny and Terry Lammers, co-founders and managing members of Innovative Business Advisors. Steve will present the update on guidance from federal and local governments around the COVID programs aimed for small businesses. And then after we hear from Steve and Terry, we will hear from Brian Rogers, founder of Blue Maven Law. And Brian will provide insight regarding specifics in the mergers and acquisitions arena, excellent guidance and insight for owners who may be contemplating a transaction, who may already be in a transaction, or may have just very recently completed a transaction, especially if you were on the buy side. So with that said, Steve, I'm going to turn the mic over to you and have you go ahead and give us the summary of changes since last week.
Very good. Marquita, thank you very much for your leadership of these webinars. Appreciate you doing so. Good afternoon to our audience. We had several hundred sign up, and we will certainly make this available for replay. So we've got some interesting information to cover today. We thought we'd begin with a brief overview of the guidelines for opening up America again. What an exciting time. It seems like it's been forever, and we're very thankful to see our country begin to move in this direction. So the guidelines for the phase one are broken down into 3 specific areas. We wanted to make sure that at least our audience had the opportunity to see these for themselves. I'll also tell you that they are available on the White House website or the CDC website. So as a business owner, if you would be interested in having these guidelines to share with your team, they're available to you there, and they will also be available to you through the slides that we share with you following the end of this podcast. So for individuals, you know, basically social distancing is kind of the theme there. You can see all the guidelines. I'm not going to read them to you, but maintaining social distancing and maintaining respect for vulnerable individuals. For employers, you know, continuing to encourage telework, begin to, you know, return to work in phases, certainly be very cognizant of common area and potentially close those, you know, and so forth. And then for specific type of employers, you know, some very specific guidance as well. I know in the state of Missouri, we are still not quite there yet. We're apparently eligible for phase one, and there's some discussion about perhaps the middle of May, the governor beginning to enter us formally into phase one and beginning to allow some of that to happen. So be a great time for you to familiarize yourself with these guidelines and make sure that as you begin to get out there, you're adhering to these. So The next thing we thought we'd cover before we get into some of the updates is there's been a lot of information around the PPP and what happened during what we refer to as round one. The Treasury provided some excellent information in chart format, and we're sharing that with you here. We really want you to have the facts. So we want to make sure that our audience really has the facts from which to contend with here. So it is interesting that the average loan size for the PPP round one was $206,000. You can see how that breaks down by loan size and by the amount of loans that were issued at those particular sizes. And there were about 1.7 million loans that were dispersed. And when you think about the fact that those loans were accomplished in approximately a 2-week period of time, it's relatively astounding amount of work that took place through the SBA. I didn't pull the chart that detailed this, but the Midwest region did receive the most loans. The country was broken up into various regions, and the Midwest received the most. And a big portion of that was due to the fact that Texas was the #1 state in terms of receipt of total loan proceeds and number of loans. I do think that perhaps you'll find this interesting. Breaking down the loan dollars and number of loans by the type of business is really quite fascinating. And frankly, if you'd asked me beforehand who I would have thought would have received the most, I would have expected it would have been retail and particularly hospitality type of businesses. And surprisingly, it came out to be construction and professional, scientific, and technical services companies. So I think, on one of our earlier podcasts, I want to give all the credit to Terry here. He had emphasized how important it was to be prepared when you go to your lender and make application. And I think that the results of the round one really bear that out. Those people that went with their information in hand and had all their facts and figures correct seemingly are the ones that got their applications done and done very rapidly. So interesting result. Couple of common issues that we've heard from many of our clients in our audience, and they become so common we thought we'd take a couple of minutes to talk about them here. First thing is, number one thing we've heard is, I don't have anything for my employees to do. Why should I pay them to not work? So if I take the PPP loans and I have to pay them, why should I do that? And I think it's important to really step back for a minute and think about the PPP loans in the context of why they were developed and what the intent of the law was. So PPP stands for Paycheck Protection Program, and the administration in their infinite wisdom thought that it would be more productive for relief to be handed out through employers, because it would literally get in the hands of the working folks of America much faster than through the government portals. And I think in the state of Missouri, that's proved to be exactly right, because those folks that began to file for unemployment early in this month and late in March, I mean, we've heard from many of those people that still have not received unemployment checks, but we have several clients that have received PPP checks and have begun dispersing those to their folks. So I think it was a way that had never been tried before, and I think it was pretty good in that regard. So remember, the intent of the law was for the employer to pay their employees whether or not there was work to do, because that would put money in their employees' hand to keep the economy rolling and keep their employees solvent. And thus, you didn't have to wait for the lag of bureaucracy to take place. And I think PPP has certainly demonstrated that it accomplished that. A lot of folks have also said to me, we really need help when we reopen, not necessarily now while we're closed. Well, the point of PPP was really to put money into the economy, into the hands of the employees, to keep the economy flowing while the businesses are closed. And you're going to see today, we're going to begin to share with you one of the tenets of a new aid program that's coming on, and there will be additional follow-on aid programs available for businesses. So don't think that if the PPP runs out again, all is lost. That is absolutely not the case. Another thing that we've heard a lot of is people saying my employees can make more money on unemployment. Why would they want to come back? Well, the fact of the matter is they may not want to. That's probably factually correct. They may make more on unemployment, but within this, certainly within the state of Missouri, and I think through every other state in the nation, you cannot draw unemployment and take payments from your employer through the PPP program. And Missouri has actually printed and has begun distributing a poster for employers in the state that highlights the fact that employees cannot double dip. And if a worker is put on a temporary status of layoff or furlough and then declines their employer's request for them to come back to work, the worker in the state of Missouri is not eligible for unemployment benefits. So, you know, this does put some power in the hands of you as an employer, but obviously the responsibility is for you to continue to make payroll for your people. And that's really the intent of the PPP. So think of the PPP for what it was intended to do. So that'll get me a little bit off my soapbox and bring us right into the weekly updates. And we're going to talk first about the reappropriation of PPP, and then we'll talk about the new Main Street lending program. So I'm sure, as most folks are well aware, the Senate passed on Wednesday, and the House passed on Thursday the reauthorization for the CARES Act PPP appropriations. A couple of little changes and tweaks to the program. They did authorize $321 billion for the Paycheck Protection Program. And one of the new wrinkles is that they did a set aside of $60 billion for what are classified as underbanked businesses, which are typically delivered through small lenders and community banks. So that is a new wrinkle, and potentially opens up a side door. So if you're dealing with a large bank and you're not satisfied by the speed of which they're moving, you may want to reach out to some of these community banks and very small lenders and see if you can get some satisfaction quicker from those folks. The other thing they did in this bill was to reauthorize $60 billion for the Economic Injury Disaster Loan Program. So while the PPP applications will resume on Monday morning, the EIDL loan will also be open for business on SBA.gov. So you'll be able to go direct to SBA.gov. If you have not already made your application for an EIDL loan, now is the time to do so. And I can't emphasize that enough. Our guest, Brian, and I were on a call earlier today, and it is, the banks are getting some guidance that it is anticipated that these funds may run out very quickly. So if you have been waiting to apply and have your information together, don't wait any longer. Get in line and get your applications in as early as you can on Monday. And if you're still thinking of applying and haven't taken the time yet to get your information together, there is no time like the present. Spend the next couple of days getting your information together and be ready to apply on Monday if you think your business is going to need this type of aid. And then finally, they added $75 billion for hospitals and $25 billion for coronavirus testing. And it is assumed that the majority of that coronavirus testing money will go out to healthcare and state organizations for the testing process. So that's an update on the reappropriation. Let me talk to you a little bit about a new program that is in the pipeline and will be coming out. And this is called the Main Street Lending Program. And of course, we have a new government acronym to learn, MSLP. And so you'll be hearing more about that as we go forward in each of these weekly notes. These are going to be loans that are delivered by lenders as well. So you wouldn't go to SBA.gov or any other government site. You'll go directly to your lender. And these loans are designed for small and medium-sized businesses. And these loans, from a lender perspective, while there won't be an SBA backing or an SBA guarantee on them, the loans are able to be sold by the bank at a 95 cents on the dollar rate back to the Federal Reserve. So there's a lot of safety that the banks won't have to worry about the integrity of getting repaid on these things. They are expanding the eligibility, so it goes up to 10,000 employees or less, and revenues of 2.5 billion or less. So obviously this goes beyond the small business community right up into what's considered the medium-sized business community in America. Today, the loans are scheduled to be extended over a 4-year period of time. And I want to emphasize here that all of these criteria that we're laying out for you today are what's known today. So these things are prone to change, just as the PPP and EIDL loans did over the last 6 weeks. We could expect to see that maybe some of these criteria will change as this program gets formalized and released. There is also a full deferment up to 1 year for principal and interest. This is not a forgiveness. This is a deferment. So a deferment would be added on to the back of the loan if, in fact, somebody that received one of these loans elected to take that deferment. Very low fees. The other programs, the PPP and the EIDL, did not have any fees attached to them. This does. This has 100 basis points, or 1/10 of 1% as a fee, and that's 1/10 of 1% of the loan value. And then the interest rate today is forecasted to be at prime plus 1/4 of a point up to maybe 4/10 of a point. And they are also writing about it as potentially an adjustable rate loan. So again, these terms may change. And then another very good factor of these loans is there is no prepayment penalty associated with these loans as well. They are currently talking about minimum levels of loan value, and right now the amount is at $1 million. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce has strongly come out in favor of significantly reducing that, and I think that if you've got an opinion on this, it'd be a great time for you to reflect that opinion over to the Federal Reserve. A really interesting feature of this is it can be either a new loan or added to an existing loan that you have. So these are designed for business owners typically to go to their existing banks. And if you've got an existing loan, potentially this can be added onto that existing loan. However, the loan cannot be used to refinance your existing loans. It just becomes an amendment, an addition to your existing. And you cannot use the proceeds from these loans for stock repurchases or capital distributions. So it is basically utilized for working capital or any other business expenses, but not to distribute to owners. You have to certify again that the loan would be required because of the COVID pandemic. And there is some current requirements that you maintain payroll and retain your employees. So quite an interesting program, and we look forward to getting a lot more details on that. You can count on us on this channel every Friday at 3 o'clock to bring you the latest information on these loan programs, so stay tuned. I want to re-emphasize, if you have not received PPP or EIDL or have not applied for that yet, there is no time like the present. Spend the next couple of days getting your information together and be ready to go Monday morning, because the windows are going to open up again on Monday morning. So with that, let me transition and say we are honored and delighted to have with us today Mr. Brian Rogers. And Brian is an attorney with Blue Maven Law. Brian's specialty is transaction law, and he is one of the busiest attorneys in our marketplace. He does fantastic work for small businesses, and we are very honored that Brian would carve out an hour or more of his time to come be with us. And Brian, with that, I'm going to turn it over to you and ask you to give us the latest information for our business owners on M&A transactions.
Great. Thanks, Steve. Here we go.
And I'll give you the mantle.
All right. And there we go. So I'll be talking about mergers and acquisitions in the era here of early era of coronavirus. So, you know, on any kind of video production, it takes a team. My team members here tend to, I don't know, kind of pipe up whenever they want to. So I thought I'd introduce them here at the beginning. We got Jack, Sophie, and Rocky. So hopefully my production team will be happy and silent, but if you hear barking in the distance, it's probably one of them. So as an attorney, of course, I have to give a legal disclaimer. I'm here to provide general information about merger and acquisition activity here, and also to answer general questions. But I unfortunately can't give any specific legal advice. And although I'm happy to answer questions, I also can't give you advice about specific situations. So anyway, just keep that in mind. And of course, contact your own attorney if you do have legal questions. So here's a little sneak peek of what I'll be talking about. First, just kind of an overview of the current state of mergers and acquisitions as I've experienced it in the past couple of months, the role of the Small Business Administration in small business mergers and acquisitions, the effect of the SBA and what they do and are doing on current transactions. That's basically transactions that were midstream when the world kind of fell apart at the end of February, early May. And then I'll talk specifically about the PPP loan program and M&A deals. So first off, we'll start with the M&A, current state of M&A. So what I've seen as far as current deals that were in process as of the last week of February, when the stock market just really started to take a downturn, and which really got our attention here in the US. We've been kind of monitoring coronavirus first in China and then in Europe. But toward the end of February, beginning of March, investors in public stocks really started paying attention and got worried about it. And that's what really started, kind of the change in the environment. So, so in my experience, several things have happened with deals. Some of them closed pretty soon after the stock market downturn. I had at least one that died of natural causes. If you've done any deal work at all, you know that happens from time to time. I don't think it had anything to do with coronavirus or the uncertainty, other than it might have given the buyer some cover to pull out of the deal. On one of my deals, the seller took a pause in order to take advantage of the PPP loan. I think that's probably pretty risky. In the deal world, we always say that time kills deals, and to purposely put your transaction on pause for 2 months or more in order to take advantage of the PPP loan program it carries its own risk. I also had at least one buyer who put the deal on pause in order to evaluate the environment. Things had changed, and even though it looks like the target company is still doing well, he just wanted more information. He felt like he did by taking a little bit of time and letting things kind of pan out one way or the other. And I have one that is possibly restructuring. I'll talk about that in a little bit in order to take advantage of the PPP loan program. And then there are others that are getting close to closing, and it's more or less business as usual, at least for now. So in short, some businesses are thriving in this environment. Depends on what industry you're in, but some are actually doing better because of this. Some businesses are doing okay. Of course, some businesses are struggling, and some have basically just been shut down because they just can't operate at the moment. So, and in my experience, new deals are still coming in, surprisingly at about the same rate that they have been over the past trailing 12 months or so. But one thing I can say is that everybody is nervous, not just business owners, but also lenders. There's obviously more risk that's been introduced into the business environment. and people are nervous about what is going to happen. And so I'm definitely hearing that and feeling that from all sides. So next, I'd like to talk a little bit about the role of SBA in small business M&A. So deals are financed in a number of ways. You know, sometimes the buyer pays cash, sometimes from retirement accounts, sometimes just from cash that they have on hand. Sometimes business acquisitions are financed, at least in part, by the seller through seller financing. I've seen a number of specialized situations as far as financing. For instance, business assets contributed to the buyer in exchange for equity in the buyer. Or, you know, I've had a stray deal be funded basically through the operations of the target company post-closing through an earnout. Although earnouts aren't unusual in transactions, sometimes they're the sole source of financing depending on the transaction. One thing I will say about financing and the SBA's role in the small business market, and the deals that I see are mostly $3 million and below. I do some transactions up to, you know, 10 million or so, but really we're talking about either Main Street transactions or transactions that most people would categorize at the very lower end of the lower middle market. And in these transactions, if there's bank financing, almost universally that financing is going to be backed by the SBA. And, you know, if it weren't for the SBA programs, then the banks wouldn't be lending. And so that's true of almost every transaction that I work on that is financed by a bank. And most of the time it's through the 7A loan program. Sometimes working capital will be financed through a program called Express. And then sometimes either real estate or equipment or both will be financed through the 504 program. So moving on to the effect of the SBA on current transactions, some lenders are comfortable with the current environment, but only as long as the borrower's business is holding up. If you talk to many lenders in detail about transactions, you'll learn pretty quickly that they have, each lender has its own appetite for risk, whether it be underwriting risk of, you know, how risky is this transaction, or something that I refer to as SBA loan risk, which is basically, you know, how closely do the terms of the deal and the deal structure comply with the SBA rules. And every lender has its own risk appetite in both of those categories. I have seen some lenders hit the pause button. They really, you know, like my buy-side lender, I think that's Jack, if you can hear him piping up, but I guess someone's at the door upstairs. So, but some lenders are hitting the pause button, like the buyer and seller that I mentioned earlier. They're just uneasy in the current environment, and they just are, you know, waiting to see what happens, and they don't want to close because they feel uncomfortable with their underwriting in the current environment. One thing to for borrowers especially to think about is at every SBA loan closing, they have to sign certifications. And there's one certification that in the past I haven't spent a lot of time thinking about, but it's basically an material adverse change certification that basically the borrower's financial condition, organization, operations, or fixed assets haven't changed since the date of the loan application. So, you know, I've got transactions that are in midstream, and the borrowers on these transactions sign loan applications in a totally different environment. And so they need to consider, you know, whether they can make those, this certification at the end, if you know, if they get to closing. So I will say that, you know, in the near future for transactions that require SBA financing, it's a little bit bleak. There's underwriting challenges. You know, as new deals are underwritten, the financial statements that the lending decisions are going to be based on are going to start to be more and more in the post Corona period. You know, up till now, I mean, even if you have first quarter financials through the end of March, there's a good chance that a business that's starting to feel stress, you know, that stress won't be showing up until after those financials. But, you know, as more and more time passes and you're having to have deals underwritten, you know, based on April financials and later, businesses that are going to be showing stress in this environment are going to be showing that in the financials. Another problem, and I'll talk about it a little bit more in a minute, but there's a potential lack of funds for the 7A program because of the new legislation that was passed with the PPP program. And also, as far as new deals, you know, I mentioned earlier that overall people, including lenders, are nervous. And so I think for new deals coming in, that can be a problem. Now, I did mention that it seems that so far deal flow really hasn't slowed down yet. I fully expect that to happen. And I haven't had any new SBA deals come in, but there are still people buying and selling businesses. But I just don't see new SBA loans being you know, used to finance these businesses in the near term. So now we'll talk for a couple of minutes about the PPP program and how that affects mergers and acquisitions. The biggest challenge with the PPP loans is that they really aren't consistent with the most common deal structure, which is an asset sale. And one of the reasons is, and I'll talk in a minute a little bit more closely in more detail about what I mean by an asset sale, but it's the most common way to structure a small transaction. And in order to qualify for the PPP loan, the borrower must have been in business as of February 15th, 2020. In an asset purchase, generally the buyer will create a new company to buy the business from the seller. And they're not operating yet, even now. And so from what I can tell, they're not, and I've spoken with several lenders to get their take on it. And pretty much the consensus seems to be that they just don't comply. And if you read the text of the CARES Act, I mean, that's pretty much what you'll be left thinking. Another issue is that if the seller takes out a PPP loan before closing, the actual closing will probably cause the loan to mature. So, you know, if the lender takes out the seller takes out a PPP loan now and they close in a couple of weeks, that loan's going to come due almost definitely, and they'll have to repay it. Now, I don't know if that means that they wouldn't be, that would make them ineligible for loan forgiveness, or if they could have loan forgiveness for the 2 weeks that they were operational and using funds for appropriate purposes before closing. But that's an open question that I'm hoping to get some guidance on soon. So, but it's a real challenge for businesses that are contemplating getting a PPP loan, or that already have but are in the middle of a sale. The most obvious solution is to restructure the transaction from an asset sale to a stock sale. And I'll do we have time, a couple of minutes, Marquita, to go through a little bit of explanation? I don't want to get into the weeds too much, but it might be helpful to illustrate what I mean by asset sale versus stock sale.
Yeah, just a quick overview on that, and then we'll let the questions take us where we need to go in terms of the detail.
Okay, perfect. So this is a little diagram of the company that's for sale before the transaction happens. And so this circle represents let's say a corporation, and it has business assets and liabilities inside the corporation, and then the shareholders own the stock to the company. And then here's a little diagram of the buyer. So he probably, or she probably set up an LLC, put some cash in it to do the transaction. So before your transaction happens, this is what you have. You got your buyer entity over here, your seller over here. In an asset sale, the business assets actually are transferred from the target company into the buyer's company, and the cash is transferred the other way. And that's problematic for the PPP loan, because those proceeds of the loan are likely to be transferred. And at any rate, the lender is not going to permit you to basically gut the borrower, the PPP borrower, of its assets without being repaid. So here's the result of the asset sale. You've got the business assets over here. Cash has been transferred to the selling company, and usually, some or all of the liabilities will stay. So so even though the seller might be able to qualify for a PPP loan, the benefits of the loan are probably going to be unwound when you close. So in contrast, when you do an equity sale, the business stays intact, but the only thing that changes is the ownership of the business changes hands to the buyer. And so this loan, the business, everything stays intact. So even though you'll need definitely need to get permission from the PPP lender to do this transaction, I think it's most likely going to be doable. So here's the result of the equity sale. And so with that, that's the end of my portion of the presentation, and I'll throw it back to Marquita.
Okay, Brian, thanks so much. Great insight. We do have quite a few questions queuing up here. And while we have answered some of the questions in the background, I'm going to go back and reiterate some of those questions. So first, I want to begin with, let's see, find them. Steve, you're there, right?
I am, yes.
Okay, great. Some of these questions are for you. So the one that I'm looking for, here it is. One of the first questions asked by Carla. What action should you take as business owner if you call an employee to come back and they say they don't want to come back due to concerns about the coronavirus? We are an essential business with very little contact with the public. So it's an essential business, little contact. She does not say whether or not that employee was furloughed or whether the person was just working or not working with pay. So Steve, do you want to tackle that one for Carla?
Sure. If the person was out on any type of sick or emergency leave due to COVID-19, the employer has a responsibility to continue to pay them up to specific limits, depending upon whether they took sick leave or whether they took emergency leave. So two different classifications of leave. So I'm going to assume for a minute that that doesn't apply, and that perhaps they were furloughed, so I'll take it if they were furloughed or if they weren't furloughed. If they were furloughed and they're called back to work and they don't return to work, then they are not eligible for unemployment. So that employee basically, is basically resigning from that position at that perspective, and there's no responsibility back on the employer. If they have not resigned, we're not furloughed, we're not out on leave, and then are refusing to come to work because of safety concerns, the employer would have to deal with that just like you would with any employee that's refusing to come to work, right? So I don't think there's any real special provisions here. I would emphasize we are not payroll and HR experts by any stretch of the imagination. Please relay this circumstance to your trusted advisors in that regard. But we do know that if they're out for sick or emergency leave, certain things do apply. And if you have furloughed them and they're using unemployment and you call them back, then they will not be eligible for unemployment if they do not take your return to work order. So hope that helps, Carla.
Yeah, and there's some things under the Families First Act that may apply there also. So Steve, I think you give great idea, contact your employment person to make sure you handle it right. So Marquita, we got another one that says, we received new information about the shared work and PPP forgiveness. Is the interpretation correct that in order for the PPP loan to be forgiven, an employer cannot decrease salaries and wages by more than 25%? I think there was some new guidance on that, wasn't there, Steve?
Yeah, so I'm not sure that you can even decrease it by 25%. So again, I would invite you to reach out to, if you're using a payroll company or have a business attorney that you're working with, it's a great opportunity to get some clarification on that. But this does bring up another point that we wanted to raise on today's webinar. There is some guidance that was just issued last night from the Department of Treasury on forgiveness for PPP loans. And one of the things that takes place when you apply for a PPP loan is that you basically have to certify, you are self-certifying that your business has been affected by this COVID-19. And the most recent guidance that they provided last night has come out in light of, what many of us have seen in the news media about some of these public companies that have taken PPP loans and have since turned them back in. And there are certainly been other companies that are otherwise healthy that are not affected by the current pandemic, but have elected to take PPP loans just because they can. And what the guidance refers to from Treasury and SBA last night is, if you certified that you were affected or were fearful that you were going to be affected and you took the money, you've got until May 7th to turn the money back in without any recourse whatsoever. But if they after May 7th, if they find out that you were a public company that had other resources available to you, or you took the money and you were not otherwise affected by this, there could be some recourse against you as a company, because they are going to view that as a fraudulent representation of your circumstances as a business. So we would invite you to review this with your business attorney and with your accountant, and make sure that if you have taken the PPP loan, that you are fully justified in its use and that you feel very confident in the ability to defend yourself. I would say if you're walking close to that line, just be very cognizant of the fact that, there have been enough companies that have been shown to be, walking over the line, that they're starting to pay attention to where that line is. So make sure that you are in compliance with the law and don't put yourself at risk.
Steve, that's a great point that you make. And the interesting thing, I've got another question here on loan forgiveness that I'm going to raise. But the question is, or the point being, the loan's not forgiven until the loan is forgiven. So you really have to stay up to speed on what the rules and guidance are around forgiveness. And that's specifically what this question asks here. Aaron says that he saw an article in the Wall Street Journal stating that some public officials, perhaps a senator, was proposing that there be changes to the forgiveness rules for PPP. And he's essentially asking, can this be done given that many people have applied for the funds already?
Well, I think that, the congressional leaders can write pretty much any law they want to write. And whether or not the court allows, that law to be enforced is a different matter. I would tell you, stay abreast of it. We're going to keep, ourselves well informed about the guidance. We look at the guidance every single day. We are not attorneys. We are not payroll experts. We do a lot of work in the M&A world. We do a lot of work with business owners, and we always say, if you hear something from us, go to the rest of your trusted advisor network. Go to your payroll experts, go to your business attorneys, go to your bankers, and verify that is the case. We feel a responsibility to keep everybody informed of things as it comes out, and we will continue to do that.
Okay, Steve, one other question from Dave regarding a situation that involved a a sole proprietor, and he's inclusive here of sole proprietors, independent contractors, 1099, and single member LLCs. And we know that early on there was a bit of a delay in getting guidance out regarding the PP loan for those category of businesses. And specifically what he's asking is, given the scenario now, should people in those categories go ahead and apply for PPP loans?
Absolutely. Absolutely apply. So here is the thing that you need to be aware of. So if you're a sole proprietor or an independent contractor, and by the way, I will tell you, check our YouTube channel over the next couple of days. We're going to be releasing a separate video specifically addressed to sole proprietors and independent contractors. And what I would tell you is you absolutely do apply under PPP and EIDL. So you have the right to apply for both of those programs. If you're a sole proprietor, an independent contractor filing a Schedule C, which is what would be the predominant way to record your taxes, you're going to use line 31, the profit and loss of your sole proprietorship, as your as the payroll of the owner. And that's limited, of course, to 100,000. So if your business made more than 100,000 on line 31, you're only allowed to use up to 100,000. And that would become the basis for doing the calculations for your PPP loan. So Marquita, did that answer the question in full?
Yeah, I think it did. And of course, you know, a big part of that answer is some of that guidance is still coming, but we do know that there is attention being given. And I think, Steve, the other thing you might reiterate is what we saw as a result of last night's legislation, I believe signed late yesterday, was that money was set aside very specifically for categories of businesses who may have not gotten into the mix in round one. So hopefully with those set asides, round two will allow people like your sister, I believe that was David, to get into the second round. And Steve, you might speak to that.
Yeah, absolutely. They did a special set aside on this round two of $60 billion for small and community banks to address the unbankable. Again, I would say be in a position where you can submit your application Monday morning. So call your local bank, and if you're not dealing with a smaller community bank, you might want to call around to some of the smaller and community banks and see if they are in a position where they'll take your application immediately and process it as well. You can only take one loan. You can make as many applications as you want, but you can only take one loan. So if you make multiple applications, whoever comes to you with the loan documents first is probably the one that you want to sign up with.
And Steve, we might be of note for our participants. You know, we've run into several situations like this where, you know, they're banking with a big bank, and you're putting your application literally into a portal with nobody ever contacting you, and just left to wonder, where is it at? Some of these smaller community banks are very helpful right now. They're caught up. Some of them that I've talked to are pretty caught up on the application process, and they're willing to take on a new client if they're within their market area and, you know, haven't had a previous lending relationship with the person. And that's important. So you do need to do, you know, kind of play MacGyver a little bit and search out different banks. So, but if you can get to somebody where they can talk to you. I mean, my example yesterday was I had a person that I referred to, we referred a person, and it was obvious that it was just a logger jam, and you were trying to, you know, refer people to multiple people because there's banks that were taking applications and then it wasn't taking applications. And yesterday I called another small community bank, and he's like, yeah, we're kind of caught up. I can help him today. So, you know, that's kind of the situation that you're looking for. And I had contact with him again today, and things are moving along nicely for him. So you have to be proactive on this deal.
You're right, Terry. Proactive and persistent. And, don't let the process get you down, that you can get through this process. So great to hear that. Well, it looks like we have no additional questions at this point in time. Okay, no, we did get Maddie, a question from Maddie very quickly here. Can you clarify what one loan means? Is that PPP only? And yes, Steve, go ahead and answer that. When you said they can only apply for one loan, clarify what you meant there.
Correct. So they can only receive one PPP loan. So if they apply at multiple banks, they might eventually get multiple banks to say yes to them, but they can only take one loan. And remember that every bank has to register the loan with the SBA. So, if you've received multiple loans, the SBA is going to know about it in short order. So, and that is considered fraudulent in the law. So be careful about that. But yes, you can apply for as many as you want, but you can only take one.
Yeah, so we just had another question pop up. Is it necessary to reapply for PPP or EIDL if you applied already? So I would tell you, you don't need to reapply for the EIDL. You're into that loan is issued directly by the SBA, and you're in the system, so don't worry about that. For the PPP, go back to exactly what Steve's been talking about. If you're at that loan, you have to apply through a bank. I had a guy call me yesterday and he's like, I filled out my application, but I don't know where to send it. It's like, no, you got to apply through the bank. Go to your bank, because and every bank will have a little bit of a different process. The situation I was referring to just a little bit ago came from a big bank, and they was asking for things like copies of the utilities, copies of their rental contract. That's not necessary. That bank is doing it wrong. They shouldn't be asking for stuff like that. You need that stuff to prove your forgiveness of the loan, but not in the application process. So, but the bottom line is you got to go through the bank. So, if you're running into a dead end with one bank and you can find another bank that, somebody's there to help you make it through the process, by all means do it. But as Steve said, you can only accept one loan.
Okay. And then Steve, again, Maddie's asking for absolute clarification on this. She says she understands that she can have only one PPP, but can she have other loans, like combinations of PPP and EIDL, or combinations of benefits from other programs?
Yes, absolutely. So she could actually have an SBA bridge loan, which allows an express bridge loan, and that would eventually roll into an EIDL loan and a PPP loan at the same time. So technically she could end up with, at one time, almost 3 different loans, but the express bridge loan is by its designed to roll right into the EIDL loan when the EIDL loan is granted.
Okay, so here's, I think this might be our last question from Mary Beth. And the question is, her business is an S Corp. She is the only employee within the business. However, she has a handful of contractors. She has personally, as owner, been receiving unemployment for a month, but she just received funding for her PPP loan. So should she stop making unemployment claims now? How can she unwind this? If her business is not opened up in 2 months due to COVID, can she then go back to unemployment?
Yes, so she needs to immediately stop taking unemployment. She cannot use PPP and unemployment at the same time. So she would need to stop taking unemployment, use the PPP funds up for, the next 8 weeks or so. And then after that period of time, and if her business hasn't returned, she can go back and refile for unemployment. She would be eligible for up to 39 weeks of unemployment.
Great. Okay, good. Thanks, Steve, for that. So we're coming to the end of the webinar. We've answered all open questions at this point. If any other questions pop at this point in time, we will answer those in the transcripted Q&A answers that we send out as a result of the mailer that you'll receive in the next day or so. What we're going to do now is I want to give an opportunity. First, thank Brian Rogers for joining us today. Great information that you shared with us, Brian. I'm going to go ahead and wind it down. I'm going to give Terry and Steve an opportunity to make some final comments. And then on the very back end, Brian, I'll give you an opportunity to have the last word in terms of comments. So I'll open it up to you first, Steve. Any comments you want to make before we close out?
Yeah, Marquita, first off, thank you very much for your moderation of these events week by week. We appreciate your dedication to this, and you're doing a marvelous job. We're very proud of you. I would say, again, there are clarifications coming out on almost a daily basis. I think this week we got 3 significant clarifications from Department of Treasury and SBA. So please stay tuned. These things are changing. There will be additional aid programs in play. There are many avenues of aid, and it begins with managing your own cash flow. So, you know, start with your own cash flow first. Make sure you're as good a steward as you can possibly be with your own money, and then use the aid appropriately. And, you know, I would emphasize that the team at IBA is here to help you. You can go to our website and click on any of the contact methodologies, and we'd be delighted to engage with you and answer questions for you, you know, between these webinars. But please tune in again next Friday, and we'll be happy to share with you the most recent updates that we've got to that point. And with that, I'll turn it over to Terry.
Yeah, thanks, Steve, and thank you, Marquita. You know, the overriding thing that we've talked about way before the COVID crisis is have your tax returns done, have your financial statements up to date, and just as important, know your banker. That's very important, and it's especially glaring right now. So those are things that we would have told you before, but especially now, it's rearing its head that the people that are succeeding in getting these funds are the people that have all their financial information up to date and they know their banker. So get to know your banker.
Okay, thanks,
Now,
Terry. Brian, give us the last word.
Thanks, Marquita. I appreciate it, Steve and Terry, for the invitation to participate today. It's always good to work with you guys on deals. Very professional, and you know what you're doing. That's great. So as an attorney, that's pretty important. But anyway, I agree as far as knowing your banker. And one thing I've observed is community banks right now are pretty much shining because of that, because they tend to be smaller and have more personal relationships with their clients. But and you know, people aren't being thrown into a portal. But anyway, I appreciate being here, and it's interesting times for sure. Deals are still getting done, but there's certainly a lot of uncertainty. And like I said, there's a lot of nervousness on every part of every deal.
Well, Brian, we're honored that you took the time, and Brian is an outstanding M&A attorney. We can't say enough about having, you know, the great experts on your team. And if you are contemplating a transaction at any time in the near future or in the distant future, we would strongly encourage you to use an excellent attorney like Brian to help guide you in that process. So Brian, we're very thankful for your participation today. We appreciate it very much.
I really appreciate it. Thanks.
Okay, again, thanks to everyone for your participation today. As a reminder, within the next 24 to 48 hours, we will have available and send you an email with a link to our YouTube channel. You'll have access to the recording of this webinar, along with all of the slides that were used during the webinar and a transcript of the Q&A. So thanks everyone for joining. With that, I'm going to close out the webinar. So thank you again, everyone.
have a great weekend.